Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this useMYdata webinar. My name is Richard Ballarand, and I'm one of the members of the advisory group for useMYdata. Both a patient and a carer, I'm a multi-hatted lay advisor for a range of health sector organizations, such as the European Institute for Innovation and Technology, Health Data Research UK, and the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE, and I will be chairing the webinar today. useMYdata is a movement of patients, carers, and relatives. We are the only independent patient movement focused on patient data and focused on highlighting the many benefits of this healthcare data to save lives and improve care for all. For our webinar this morning, you will see that your microphones and cameras are disabled, but you should all be able to see and hear our panelists on screen. Please use the question and answer throughout the session. So if you have questions, please do type them in so you don't forget them. Everyone will be able to see all the questions. So if you keep an eye on the Q&A box and see a question when someone else is asked that you think is important, you can vote it up for either one or many. I will be putting your questions to speakers during the session according to the votes that they receive. We also have some polls that we'd like you to fill in at different parts of the webinar. We're recording the webinar today, and it will be on the useMYdata website in a few days' time. Feel free to use any social media throughout. If you like to tweet, please tag at useMYdata or use the useMYdata hashtag. The topics for all useMYdata events are defined and agreed by its members, who are patients, relatives, and carers. Today's webinar is slightly different. We will hear a short update about some of the work that useMYdata has done over the last year and the plans for the next 12 months. But our main focus is on the hearing from some of our members and about how they have used the principles developed by useMYdata in other areas, whether it is with a research project or in dealing with their own GP practice. As is usual with our webinars, we have a very mixed audience today of patients, carers, relatives, NHS, academia, commercial companies, and more. We've asked each of our speakers to avoid acronyms, but if there are things that you don't understand, please tell us by using the Q&A, that is question and answer function. Anyway, so first, I would like to ask Chris Carrigan, who is useMYdata's expert data advisor, to say a few words about the work of useMYdata over the last year and the significant impact that this has had. Chris, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Richard, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. It's nice to see a good mix of people. You never know who you can get for these webinars, so it's really good to see a real good mix of people there. I think I've only got about 8 slides, and what we wanted to do was to just revisit what has been achieved through useMYdata in the last 12 months. So Emily, could you just pop on to the next slide? The first one I wanted to highlight, piece of work I wanted to highlight, was around the GP data planning and research, GPDPR, confusingly titled. I think this was a perfect example of the impact that useMYdata can have when it picks up an issue, brings the patient voice to the table, which we did with an emergency patient webinar back in 2021, and pushes an agenda to make a direct impact on, in this case, on things like transparency. So when we convened the webinar, there was no transparency whatsoever around what was going on with GPDPR, a lot of confusion, a big data void, and we did a huge amount of work to try and persuade the authorities to publish information about what was going on with GPDPR. And that's actually been successful because they now been published the details of the different oversight groups which existed, which we didn't know about previously. So one of the key things we push on is transparency. And there's a real good example here of something which wouldn't really have happened unless we had pushed it quite hard. Interestingly, we were also invited to join one of the panels around GPDPR to feed your views directly in to that panel. So there's a direct impact of our work on a significant thing around GP data for planning and research. That's still ongoing, I have to say. I'll mention something about that towards the end of the webinar. Emily, could you pop the next slide? Like Chris Whitty here. The second piece of work I wanted to highlight was similarly around transparency. So whilst we were responding to the COVID pandemic across the NHS, there was a COVID-19 data store which was generated. So lots of the data around the NHS was in different places, and to help in the response to the pandemic, a large data store was generated which pulled data together from lots and lots of different sources. And it was really helpful to manage the pandemic. The issue that we had that we highlighted was there were lots of good things that had happened because of using the COVID-19 data store, but nobody knew about it because nothing had been published about any of the data uses, any of the data releases, any of the data accesses. And in that void of information, that lack of transparency, there were all sorts of questions about what was going on. So over a long period of time, after we'd had another patient webinar on this to get a commitment, but we didn't get any clear dates. After a long period of working with NHS England and NHS EI over many months, we actually managed to get this escalated up through them to the point where a release register was published. It wasn't threatening, but what it did highlight was the uses that had been made of the COVID-19 data store that actually were quite beneficial. So it really improves it's a step towards increased transparency around these things. And you'll see transparency coming through a thread of a lot of these things. Next slide. So as well as pushing at the sort of national level, what we were hearing from lots of you was that you wanted to have things available to you that you could use in your local discussions, whether it's in local groups, with your GP practice, with other organizations or research teams that you're working with, a range of people. And what you wanted was sets of position statements. So these position statements were developed by the members of useMYdata, and there's the 5 of them you can see listed on there. They're all on the web, which really just highlight what we expect to happen with data, what we would like to see happening with data, and highlighting many of the benefits of patient data, and indeed pushing on transparency. There've also been some around information around things like trusted research environments to explain more easily what these things are, so you can have a more of an informed conversation across the membership using these position statements. So those are, again, all on the web, all developed by members and readily available for use. Number 4 is the acknowledging and raising awareness of patient data, which is essentially the patient data citation. And Em, if you just flick to the next slide. I just want to put one more slide specifically about that. So the patient data citation was developed quite a while ago now by the members, which was a simple form of words that we'd like to see appearing on the bottom of reports, statistics, articles, and other things, that just highlighted that none of this work would have been possible without data being provided by patients. It was sort of closed in a loop and a bit of a thank you. So it's been adopted over many months, and just looking through the last 12 months, I just worked through to see who else had been picking this up. And rather than it plateauing, we saw a significant increase in the uptake of this citation. If you simply Google the words and put them in quotation marks to get the exact phrase, you'll see thousands of these things coming up. And if you look across the academic publications, you'll see this is now becoming much more routine. So rather than people thinking about something to include, this is becoming more standard in terms of processes for reports and publications and websites and other things as well. So something which was developed by patients, by members, has now pushed its way out into a huge number of organizations who now see this as standard practice. That just would not have happened without us. Thanks, Em. Next slide. As well as developing the various documents that the members wanted to have in terms of information resources, things to help them in their work, it also generated other sets of documents around clear principles. So principles around access to health records, which we might hear about later, and principles around transparency, which we've had defined for a while. And these, again, are now being picked up and cited and used by lots of organizations as best practice. And these were directly developed by you, wouldn't have existed otherwise, and we've managed to push those into a very wide range of organizations who now are beginning to use these things as standard practice. So the principles which we defined as transparency around how we want our data to be used are now being implemented across organizations. There's a lot of work to do on that still, but I think that's a good example of something that wouldn't have happened without us being there. Next slide, Em. Over the past 12 months, we've seen lots of organizations recognizing that as a movement, we can provide some good, direct, informed insight and challenge into different areas. One here is a National Data Guardian panel, which up until not so long ago didn't have a a lay rep, a patient rep on the group. So we'd work with the panel, and we actually managed to get Maisie McKenzie as the first patient representative on the National Data Guardians panel. And in fact now, because that's been seen as really positive, there's a second patient that's now been added. So this is a direct result of us working with different organizations to demonstrate that patients can have a voice on fairly complex work. You just click again, Em. And one of the quotations that you'll see there is directly from the National Data Guardians annual report, which highlights the fact that we did this with them when we got the patient on the panel, and it's actually been a really positive thing, providing different perspective and constructive challenge. Next slide, Em. Other areas of work which we get involved with. So organizations come to us, a lot of national organizations come to us wanting some help, wanting some advice with patient views. So what we do with these things is we pass these out to the membership through the newsletters and through other means to garner your views around what you think about these things. So just one specific example, the NHSX information governance team have been regularly over the past 12 months asking us to comment on or draft or edit sets of national information governance materials that are now being published on their website, which have been used across NHS care services, and also have patient sections in there as well. And we've been doing the work for them to edit and draft and to write those things for a long period of time now, just making sure that where we're talking about complex issues to do with data, we can get people who can help provide the appropriate text, which is understandable by patients because it's written by patients. And we've done similar pieces of work with NHS Digital, NHS England, as I mentioned, the National Data Guardian, and lots of others as well. There's too many to mention on one quick update. Next slide, Em. And I think this is my last of the slide, just something I wanted to highlight. So many of you are saying that when you get notified of things like big national consultations on strategy or on policy, it's quite difficult to get your voices heard on these things. So one thing we've done over many months now is to coordinate everybody's voices and put in a single response on behalf of useMYdata. And you see there's a list of consultations and policy documents there that we've fed directly into, either using some of the statements we've already got from you or by asking you for particular views to get all your views into these things. So nobody else does this. We take any responses you get from any of our members and we use those words directly. I don't invent words, I don't invent responses. So all your words you send in to us, we collate and put in a collated response to all these different consultations. And I think what it demonstrates is we can comment on quite complex things. People are interested, but equally people have lots of different views, and our job is to reflect all those different views rather than saying there is one single view. And again, I think that's a real strength that we have that nobody else has in this area, the ability to bring lots of different people's views to quite complex consultations and really amplify our voices to those responses. If you click on, I think that might be my last slide, Em. Thank you. So that's all I want to say, Richard, just a very quick update of work that we've done in the last 12 months.
Thank you, Chris. So although it's quick, it does show the extent and the depth to which we've been involved in the whole data landscape and feeding into you know, the questions that are so essential for health now. Just to remind people, if they have questions for individuals, could they just please put them in the Q&A so that, you know, I can follow that. But given we're moving on, you can always probably pop in a question for Chris also later during the Q&A sessions that follow. But I mean, now I think it's time to move on to the work of our members. And on today's webinar, we have 6 members speaking, each bringing their own perspective of how they use the principles developed by useMYdata. We will hear from 3 of these, and then have some questions, and then hear from a second group of 3 speakers, and again followed by a question and answer session. The first speakers are Fran Husson, Rob French, and Pete Wheatstone, and each will speak for 5 minutes, and they'll each provide a mini intro, and I will of course provide a 1-minute warning. So let me begin by asking Fran Husson to start by talking about how she's championing patient access across their healthcare data. Go ahead, Fran.
Thank you, Richard, and good morning to everyone. the reasons why I'm so keen to share my medical data will serve, in fact, as a kind of introduction. I would not be here today if I had not survived a terminal case of acute myeloblastic leukemia, and if those treating me had not had access to international research outcomes based on patient data. I also have long-term respiratory diseases which do affect my speech, and I apologize for my voice and breathing problems. But sharing one's data is no simple thing. And that's really what I'd like to focus on and hopefully get lots of questions and discussion. These two issues which are linked are poor quality data, especially in primary care, and lack of patient access, again, to primary care, GP, held records. Patients are not allowed to see their GP records. They're only allowed to see a transactional, very brief summary. When you happen to be in a different care setting, let's say a hospital, for instance, and they can see your GP record, that's when you realize that it's full of errors, wrong diagnoses, omissions, all kinds of problems. It's really bad. And what I can see in my record, what I can also see in my medication list, for instance, is more errors and problems. So in my case is not isolated, and the solution should not be either. What I would like the audience to reflect on is on this issue of inaccurate and harmful data in a spirit not of blame, sorry, but of what we could all do to improve the situation, which is likely to get even more serious when one day patients are allowed to see their records. There's going to be a rush of complaints. There's going to be a tsunami of litigation and all kinds of problems. This we should be able to avoid if we had a very open and frank discussion as to what the situation is, and again, what we could try and do to improve that. Healthcare, as I've discovered with my complex medical history, healthcare is a shared responsibility between patients and the professionals. So are health data. The concept of shared decision-making, which is widely accepted, although not always put into practice, why not adopt shared data management, where patients are enabled and trusted to provide corrections as well as their own origination of medical information, which their care providers want and need. I mean, we already have some tools and processes which in fact could be used to redress this problem of data inaccuracies. We have things, for instance, such as the personal health records, or PHR as a simple acronym, which are very useful for both professionals and patients to share data. Providing patients with access to their health data would also go a very long way in improving health literacy and patient activation, both being quite poor in the UK compared to some other developed countries. Of course, there are some sensitive cases. We often talk about domestic abuse, but surely GPs should be trusted with the protection of those who need this protection. Patient access to accurate records is, in my view, fundamental to accelerate people consenting to donate, to share the data, to improve treatments, services, research. In one word, data saves lives. I would be happy to answer any question. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. And just in time, we'll move I think at this point we'll move on to Rob.
My name's Rob French. My background is working as a statistician at Cardiff University. I've been doing working with data and data linkage for about the last 10 years. My current project, or say current, it's been going since about 2016, is linking diabetes audits, that's the National Pediatric Diabetes Audit and the National Diabetes Audit for Adults, to education data, that's schools and university data. And my research focuses on England and Wales. So my motivation to start speaking to patients was to get approvals for my data. So in particular, we need your patient identifies, name, date of birth, and postcode, and so on, NHS number, in order to link the data sets. And so we had to speak to the authority tasked with authorizing that to get a special dispensation to flow that data. So I was initially working on my own, and we have patient groups at the hospital and in other places where I could speak to people and get feedback, including diabetes specific feedback. So it was okay, and it was certainly sufficient, but it didn't really feel that brilliant. So I was able to then work with some people at Diabetes UK, and they supported aspects of it, and they really had a lot more experience in speaking to people with diabetes. I'm a statistician by training. It's not my day-to-day thing. I stare at a screen all day looking at numbers, and so talking to people was quite different, and they really helped that. And also the Medical Research Council have got a regulatory support centre, and there's a guy there called Alex Bailey who was just so helpful and really helped me sort of break down a lot of the technical things I was doing in order to then feedback to young people about it and get their feedback. So last year we worked with Diabetes UK to put on 2 sessions, and then following on from that, we used the groups we built up last year to become a co-production group, and we put a big grant application into the Medical Research Council, and they to do some really good engagements and partnership, and that's what we're currently doing now. So our project is again still focusing on young people and asking them about their data, but really trying to just do it a bit better. So I'm just going to pick out 5 points about it. I've got time. So the public engagement partnerships between universities and charities, I'm really supportive of researchers doing this. It's impossible to do on your own. You really need some help, but there are barriers and difficulties about working with charities. They have lots of processes in place that make things take a lot of time, and you need these sign off by safeguarding, but some of the communications things can take a long time and can be quite frustrating. Working across data disciplines, so we're primarily focused on health data today, but we also have education data, and while young people with diabetes are sort of quite comfortable with the idea of sharing their health data, perhaps they were quite surprised to hear about education data being used and being linked. So I think we have to think a bit broader beyond health sometimes. Focus on gathering the views of young people was another focus. So it was a real challenge for me to try and change my language to make things accessible, because it was quite technical. But then beyond that was also making it interesting for young people as well, so they participate in the first place and stay engaged. We were also trying to improve the representation of certain voices perhaps less heard in patient engagement. And there's a reason they're called hard to reach groups, and it has been a challenge. And one of the things we've done is we've done a stakeholder workshop working with a consultancy to bring some leaders in from community groups, and that was useful feedback. But I think we still admitted some groups, for example, children with special educational needs. I guess it's an iterative process, isn't it? We're always learning. And then the last thing I'd like to flag is just about the collaborative and supportive nature of the public engagement sort of sector. I've been so supported by different people. People have really taken the time to help me, give me feedback on things, and I think that's just worth highlighting. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. It's great to have the perspectives from the other side of the fence as well. Now move quick to Pete.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob. What I'd like to do today is talk mainly about how I implement these principles. Just by way of background, I regard myself as a normal person. I wasn't particularly interested in healthcare until I became ill. I was a stage 3 bowel cancer, but even then it was a fairly normal standard procedure that I went through with fairly normal standard side effects from the chemotherapy, etc. But it's since then, obviously, I've taken a lot more interest in healthcare and also healthcare data. So I just want to sort of talk about the sort of things I do. I'm a fairly not typical PPI, but I'm involved in a lot of health data organizations, advising them. And I also work a lot with clinical trials. So if you like, that's like one end of the spectrum. There'll be other people this morning that talk about how they work with the NHS Digital, etc., and the large bodies to try and influence at the top end. And I do believe that if we're going to change culture around data, we have to work from the top and getting leaders to not only accept but demonstrate the behaviors that they want people below them to adopt, but we need to work from the bottom end as well. So next slide, please, Emily. I put up there the sort of organizations that I work with and who I think have done particularly well in terms of adopting useMYdata principles. If you like, in a way, I've marked my own homework. But there's 3 data organizations, the top 3 there, DataCan, Cutting Edge and Innovation Through Health Data. That's a European organization. And the final one, Foxtrot, is a clinical trial. So the point there is you can do this stuff within clinical trials, not just data organizations. Naturally, within clinical trials, we're focusing on the data aspects for the purposes of today's conversation. Next slide, please. So what's my approach? And I'm not suggesting this works for you, it's just the approach that I take. But basically, if I get involved with an organization or a research project, I want to chat first. I want to know what they want from their PPI. Is it the sort of thing I'm interested in? And more particularly, I want to gauge what their view is regarding the sort of principles around useMYdata. And my pitch, if you like, or my proposition is, I want to support the objectives of that research or that organization by raising awareness with patients and also making sure that we communicate the potential benefits of sharing and more particularly using that data, but also the risks that arise from it. But at the same time, and next click, please, Emily, I want to do other things. I want to promote and protect the interests of both patients and the public during that trial, if it's a clinical trial, and particularly around their data, as well as other things naturally if it's a clinical trial. Next click, please, Emily. And I want to hold that organization to account by ensuring they adhere to the processes, particularly around openness, honesty, and transparency. And I think when it's pitched that way, it's hard to, as a researcher or an organization, say, no, that's not what we want from you, Pete. And frankly, if they do, then I empower myself by walking away. I'm not interested in attending quarterly meetings and now maybe a 2-minute question and answer session. That's not what I'm there. I want to influence, sleeves rolled up, get stuck in and influence. So next slide, please, Emily. So what can I offer to support the organization, which was the first bullet on the previous slide? Now, I'm not going to go through this, but this is the slide that I typically show. These are areas where I can help you as an organization or as a research communicate with your patients, your participants, and the public. And I'm only limited on these items by the space on the slide. There's more besides. But it's about demonstrating here a degree of knowledge about how, because I find with a lot of research and organizations that sort of want to do PPI and they want to adopt some principles, what they're not sure about is the how. And what I'm trying to demonstrate here is a sense of knowledge, direction, and competency that we can help them do this. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say on that slide. Next slide, please, Emily. But it's really hard to get involved and influence and get organizations to adopt these principles unless you've got some degree of empowerment. And about 2 years ago, 3 now probably actually, I saw this table on Twitter. Prior to that, I've been turning up to PPI meetings and having a very interesting time. And it was the usual thing where we sort of had somebody come in, talk about their research. You might get as an individual 30 seconds to ask a question or make a comment. But beyond that, there was no feedback, and off you went, and you'd spent a very pleasant afternoon, if you like. I saw this and I realized, my goodness me, can you just click on twice, please, Emily, till you see the blue arrow? That's splendid. Thank you. I saw this on Twitter and I thought, ye gods, Pete, what have you been doing? You know, you're getting involved in these meetings, which really on this scale here, and you can see 8 steps, by the way, from Sherry Arnstein. And this was a piece of work she did, by the way, in 1963. So it's not new stuff. And she classes empowerment at various levels. And you'll see on the right-hand side, whether it's tokenism, whether it's non-participatory, or whether it's genuine power, if you like. And I realized what a lot of the things I was doing were very much in the tokenism bracket as defined by Sherry Arnstein. So what I've done since then is really think about this and say, right, I don't want to get involved in tokenistic PPI. It doesn't allow me to influence, which is what I want to do. Where do I want to be? Well, if you just do a single click, Emily, you'll see I want to be somewhere between 6 and 7. Which over on the right-hand side, you can see it's about partnership. So we negotiate, we make shared decisions, all the sort of things that Fran was, in a way, talking about in the first presentation from us patients and researchers. Ideally, I want to be in that 6 to 7 area. So delegated power to make decisions, or 6 in the partnership piece, where we distribute power. And I think in that way, because we're demonstrating we understand how to do things that helps support that research, but also enables us to pursue, if you like, an agenda through sharing of data, as well as the normal PPI stuff, normal as I described per the previous slide. And I think that for me is where I want to be. And I find it easier to introduce useMYdata principles when I have that sense of empowerment. So do I want to say anything else? I would say certainly about useMYdata principles, 2 things. I think there's 2 key learning points. One, that it's not a once and done approach, that occasional reminders with the organization or the research that you work with are necessary. Just say, do you remember we agreed this? I found that useful. Only occasionally is it necessary. And also, more importantly, to maintain this level of empowerment, to maintain the principles and the adoption in real terms, not just a verbal agreement without action. To maintain that takes real effort and trust from the researcher, the organization, and the PPI person. Okay, is there anything else that I wanted to say?
No, sort of run out of time, Pete.
Yeah,
So,
that's fine. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you, Pete, and thank you to Rob and Fran. And it is, just in the first 3 speakers, it shows this sort of breadth of the interest and also the passion that they bring. So I'd like to invite all the members of the panel to pop up, and Chris as well, I suppose, because he had questions too. And looking at the questions that came through, I can mention Chris has already answered a basic one about what is NHSX. The X stands for user experience. And now looking at the questions, I mean, the first is pretty specific. How many members are there of useMYdata? And
yeah, there are 341 in total, and that's split between members, patients, relatives, and carers, and associate members. Let's answer that one quickly.
Another one for Chris. The recent statement led by HRA and shared by a dozen public sector organizations on patient involvement in research is clearly sympathetic to UMD principles. Let's useMYdata. How can we ensure that the deeper issue of data transparency, etc., are pushed forward in this context?
It's a continued challenge, and I think it's a long process of using our influence, using our voices, highlighting where we think transparency isn't present, and making sure people are aware of that. So one of the benefits we have is our independence, which allows us to speak to a whole bunch of organizations without worrying about treading on anybody's toes, which is incredibly valuable. But from our perspective, I think we need to make sure that we keep pushing the issue of transparency, highlighting where we don't see transparency. Don't be afraid of highlighting it, highlight it again, pushing it again and shouting louder about it, because that's the best way of doing it. But doing it in a constructive and collaborative manner. If we just go and bash people, I don't think it's awfully productive. It's not really the way we work. We work in a collaborative manner to get these things changed. And we've seen that with the work we did with NHSX, NHSEI, it did have an effect. So it does work, but it's a continued challenge, I would say.
Thank you. And from an anonymous viewer, how do you manage groups when they say that everything that is said here is confidential? Now, that's something for all three of the panelists to weigh in on. Rob?
Well, so if I go first, one of the challenges we had actually relates to whether we treated our patient engagement as pure patient engagement or research, where we get your academic qualitative researchers to come in and analyze the data. We came down the latter side because we thought, well, we've got that expertise. There were issues with it, but one of the things it did do is force us to do everything properly. We have to get special approvals from the university and things, and do proper consent forms and everything. And we set out our expectations for patients in terms of what we share. So everything is recorded and considered as research. So in our particular example, we wouldn't want patients to say anything that said, just keep this confidential. Yeah. Thank you.
Pete?
So, I mean, I occasionally come across this when working with commercial customers, and I think the first question is why? Please explain to me so I can understand why it's confidential. And I think I'm less concerned about that as long as we have true interaction and we're truly putting the patient voice through to them and it's accepted. And I can live with a degree of confidentiality for a while. Again, particularly in the commercial arena. So if they have a particular product that they don't want to disclose to their competitors, I get that. I come from a commercial background. But at the end of the day, there has to be, this can't be an infinite level of or an infinite duration of confidentiality. And I think it's about understanding why and making sure we all understand that this is a finite period during which that confidentiality can apply.
Fran, did you have a comment?
Yes, in relation to the outreach work I do with a small charity, this is not a problem because when we are discussing important issues, we do not take notes and we do not record anything so that people feel really safe in terms of expressing themselves. And only the actual issue discussed is reported in minutes or used to do another meeting, for instance. So this is not really a problem. I think people are quite open to discuss all the issues they have with the NHS, whatever these issues are, as long as they feel confident that their name, that nothing relating to them is going to leave the actual room of the meeting. So it's not really a problem.
Thank you. Another question, how are useMYdata ensuring diversity among their members, and what are you doing to include the voices of underserved groups or lesser heard communities?
Shall I pick that one up? First of all, recognize it's a really tough problem. What we did some months ago is we did a census of our members to find out who the members actually are. So we broke that down by age and by geography and disease type and ethnicity and a few other things as well. And we published that on the web, and we can put a link in the summary of this when we publish this recording on the web. We can put a link to that if you like. But we were quite open about where our members were in the country, what disease, what conditions they'd had, and indeed age profile and other things. We tried to map that to what we consider to be a typical patient population. And by and large, it reflects the patient population relatively well, but there are always going to be groups which we really struggle to get access to, mainly because we're pretty small. And one of the challenges we have is to try and extend our reach with the significant limited resources we've got. That's, as I'll mention at the end of the webinar, is a real problem for us, the capacity to be able to do these things. But the last thing I would say is the reason that you are all out here as the members is to ask you yourselves, well, what could you do to help? Are there things that you could push the message of useMYdata out to your friends, your communities, in the pub, your colleagues, your sports clubs, whatever it is, to try and get the message of useMYdata out, to begin to get people more involved, and hopefully to become members and learn more about the uses of data generally. I think that will be my push back to you as well. But I think you're right, it's a real challenge.
Well, as a dynamic organization, I think it's excellent that this is an opportunity for people to see what's happening and sort of get further involved. I have a quick question here. Does useMYdata work with the James Lind Alliance on priority setting partnerships?
So Tessa, no, I don't think we have directly for the moment. No, we haven't. But happy to have a chat with you after that. And I see you've got some other questions as well in the chat. We might come to it later as well if we find time.
Yeah, Tessa has quite a few questions, statements. Is perhaps something that the panelists might want to weigh in. There is no streamlined common process to correct electronic health records, and there needs to be. Anyone?
Agreed.
Agreed. Okay.
The reality is that the data sits in lots of different places, but that's the NHS has sat behind that for too long. If you talk to a researcher like Rob, the amount of effort that every researcher in the country has to do to data clean as soon as they receive them data demonstrates that if we had invested a fraction of that amount of money in giving patients more dynamic access to understand and see their records, if not to change it, but to annotate it and have a right of reflection on it, I think it would have saved researchers data cleaning time over the years. Hundreds, thousands of hours of time.
Thank you. A final question. With the ladder, sometimes it is hard to reach the top of the ladder on smaller projects. Is it better to consult than not do any form of PPI, that's patient and public involvement, on a data project? I mean, Pete, you can lead in on that.
Yeah, by all means. I think Rob wanted to come on the other, if we're okay for time, Rush. I think Rob and I both wanted to make comments on the last point.
I think it's a really important point, and I think people are trying and have tried to do it, but it's not straightforward, and we have to be really, really careful about not putting another layer of administration on top of an already difficult process, or just changing a process to something we think is going to be better or more unified, and it's not. So I think there needs to be a lot of engagement with researchers and other people, and it's just a very hard thing to do. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done, it's just not easy. Sorry, Pete, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with Rob actually and reflect, the NHS has come, its history is fragmented prior to its formation in 1947. And I reflect in the rest of the world. I've worked for some large organisations like Lloyds Bank and Aviva, who used to be Norwich Union. And I remember in particular doing data migration work at Norwich Union. Their systems for holding insurance policies, and I'm just talking life and pensions here, amounted to 98. So every large and dynamic organisation has these problems, and as Rob says, they are not easy to solve. In an ideal world, wouldn't we all have a single record? But yeah, can I just go back then to that last question then, Richard, about I find it's easier to influence individual researchers, and whilst people can accuse me maybe of, if you like, picking off low-hanging fruit, I'd rather pick that fruit off than let it mature, drop off the tree and get trampled down and nothing happens to it. I know that's a little bit not maybe the best analogy to use, but let's pick off the easy targets first. It's always been my attitude. And I think once you've engaged, whether it's small or large, I mean, you've obviously got to scale what you do to the size of the research. You've also got to scale what you do to the size of the PPI budget, but that's a whole other issue, which we can't get into today. But individuals, I find, are easier to influence than organizations. So I think there's still things you can do.
Yeah, thank you, Pete. There's a lot that we can get involved in. A quick if Fran wants to make a final comment, because we're moving on after that.
Not really, no, I fully agree with what the other panelists have said. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to all our panelists then. And now we need to move to our second set of members who are speaking about their work. And in fact, the first set of speakers is actually a 3-in-1 from Lauren, Bob, and Aaron from Flatiron. And then we'll have, which is leading cancer-specific electronic health records group. And then we'll have Helen Balbeck and Emily Lan. And let me begin by asking Lauren, Bob, and Aaron to start speaking about how they've used the useMYdata principles of involvement and transparency when setting up their patient voices panel. Go ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard, and thank you to the useMYdata team for the invite today. My name's Aaron Sgenther, and I'm the medical lead here at Flatiron Health UK. My clinical background is urology, surgery, and I'm also a cancer outcomes researcher. I'd also like to introduce Lauren Brown, who heads up our UK team, and Bob White, who is our a member of our patient voices panel that you'll hear a little bit more about through this presentation. So a bit of background. Flatiron Health is a health data company with about 10 years of experience of bringing together clinical and technology teams with a common mission. To put it at a high level, our goal really is to bring together cancer data and all the information that's related to a patient's cancer diagnosis and treatment through their journey in the NHS from multiple, often disconnected systems in hospitals that we've touched on today. And our aim is from this data to bring it together and really create organized data sets that can be used for cancer research, but also to help hospitals and clinicians improve patient care. Next slide, please, Emily. Thank you. So Flatiron has, over the last 2 years, established local teams in UK, Germany, and Japan. And in the UK, over that time, our local team based here in the UK is really focused on how we engage with NHS trusts and health boards, key UK stakeholders like NICE, with whom we have a 3-year research collaboration that is ongoing. Organizations like HDR UK and DataCan that you can see here on our timeline. And most importantly, patients and the public. And we've tried to do all of this even before we've actually started directly working with any of our partner NHS trusts and before we've received any patient data. We're slightly pushed for time today, but to cover all of the work that we've done on patient engagement, but I'm just going to touch on some key aspects on this timeline. So we initially worked with organizations like useMYdata and the DataCan patient panel at the very beginning to really get some candid feedback on our business model, our fair value exchange with NHS trusts. And we've listened to that feedback. We've really hoped to put transparency at the forefront with our patients and with the public. And ultimately, it reinforced our desire to establish our own Flatiron Patient Voices panel, which was started in September 2021. And if I could just go to the next slide. Thanks again. So this is just our team. So it's a small but mighty team of 6 of us covering clinical, engineering, and partnerships. Brian is an oncology nurse, and he joined our team very recently. So now our actual core team is the same size as our patient voices panel, which you're going to hear a little bit more about from Bob. We have 5 cancer patients and carers, and Chris Carrigan acting as a mentor. So next slide, please. Thank you. So this is just a snapshot from a recent meeting that we had with our panel. And on this note, I'd love to pass on to Bob to speak a little bit about his experience working with us.
Thank you, Aaron. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for inviting me today as just a patient member of the public. As you can see on that last slide of Aaron's there, I'm the very good looking young gentleman on the bottom left-hand corner. My history basically is I spent 30 years in the police service, retiring in a senior rank some years ago, I have to say, and then became a fraud investigator in the banking and insurance world. My whole world then sort of, I think, collapsed at the time in 2011 with a completely accidental diagnosis of prostate cancer. I had no indication at all that I was suffering from anything at all, but I had prostate cancer. I won't bore you with the long story because it is a long story, but basically 10 years on now, I'm fully in remission. I don't like to say cured. I hate using the word cured in cancer, but I'm in remission. I'm on 6 monthly tests now, which are all good. So touch wood, thanks for that. But it made me realise all about prostate cancer, how important it is with men. Men particularly bury their head in the sand over prostate cancer, and it's usually ladies that are important in bringing men forward to get tested for prostate cancer. That's one of the bees in my bonnet. It sort of got me into thinking about what can I do to help a little bit, to give a little bit back to prostate cancer. And 5 years ago, I started a prostate cancer support group. It's just in Leicestershire, Melton Mowbray in Leicestershire, where I'm sure everybody knows where the pork pies come from. We've now built up a membership of between 40 and 50 members, which for a small town like Melton Mowbray, I think is fantastic. We're part of a local charity, as you can see behind me. Prostate is a charity, which is local to Leicestershire, Rutland and Northamptonshire, but are absolutely fantastic. And we've got a great relationship with all the local urologists, oncologists, prostate cancer nurses, etc., etc. And it's a fantastic system. Again, I could talk for hours on that, but I'm minded I've got very little time. But along the way, up popped an opportunity to look at Flatiron. And there was an invite there to apply to join the Patient Voices panel, which I thought, well, that's a cracking idea. I'm aware that there's a mountain of data relating to prostate cancer that never gets used as far as I'm concerned. And I speak from personal experience. So anyway, I applied and I was very lucky in being appointed to the panel. And I'm very proud that I'm now part of that panel with Aaron, Lauren and the others that run Flatiron in the UK. From the membership that I've got, talking to guys, just basically talking to people with prostate cancer, the data side of it is so important. People are not aware of the importance of it, and it could play such a vital part in looking at future outcomes for men diagnosed with prostate cancer, basically. And it's one of the things that sort of stirs me on, if you like. I'm passionate about trying to get improvements in men with prostate cancer. So joining the panel for me was a real boon. We've been going now for a few months. I've been asked to join into some recent projects to help Flatiron sort of, I'm trying to think of the right word to use, but it's to put out their information to people so people will understand. Quite often scientists produce all sorts of information at a high level that people look at it and go, what on earth does that mean? You know? So I think part of my job and those others on the panel is to sort of bring that down to a patient level that will say, yeah, I know what that means. That sounds good to me. And I'm interested in that. That's the sort of thing I want. So basically, I'm involved in hopefully just producing the Flatiron website. I think they're about to go on stream. And also to produce some sort of one-page flyers to advertise exactly what Flatiron do, what they can do going forward, and all that sort of thing. Because data is not a simple thing. Data is very complicated. And it's never easy. I'm sure you'll all agree on that. So anyway, that's my role. And thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you to both. In the interest of time, questions can be asked at the end. I'll pass on to Helen.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to talk today. So a little bit of my background. I run a national brain cancer charity called Brains Trust, which is very patient facing. We have a track record. I founded it after my daughter was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and then I was diagnosed with head and neck cancer. But we have a track record at Brains Trust of taking on projects that bring real meaningful change to the community. And I noticed that Patients Know Best has already been referenced this morning. We actually started that. We, as a brain cancer, it's this very small community and there's lots at play. And we've always felt that if you can get it to work with people living with brain cancer, then chances are it can work anywhere. Brain cancer is a less common cancer rather than rare. So the incidence rate is slightly higher. And the current data shows that 47% of cancers diagnosed are rare and less common cancers, and yet they account for well over 55% of cancer deaths. So the patient information portal we launched with NCRAS, we worked with Jem Rashbas, who was Director of National Disease Registration at that point. He just came to us and said, look, I've got all of this data. It doesn't belong to me. How can we get it out there so that patients can access their records? And then that was taken on by CRUK, and then it was rolled out by Patients Know Best. And I think the key thing, as you can see from this slide, is actually you can make data say anything you want it to. And as a society, we're very data rich, but actually, I think the information we gain from the data is really poor. And we've seen from our own experience in Brains Trust that data can change language if we ask the right questions. We have oceans of data, but only puddles of meaning. And so for us, the work I'm going to share with you today was very much about establishing methodologies. And it's very much a start of a longer journey where we want to pull together the National Cancer Patient Experience surveys, the hospital episode data, the HES data, and routes to diagnosis, so that jointly you could tell stories from what this data is telling us. And all of these can be used for non-clinical purposes, so for research, for planning health services, and improving outcomes for patients and people with the lived experience. So for us initially, we were looking at the data, just thinking it's time, we've got the data, it's time we moved beyond the traditional markers of morbidity and mortality and overall survival, gender, age and prevalence, because there is so much more now that we can find out and that we're interested in. So should we, for example, in brain cancer, stop talking about cure and be talking instead about extending life? We shouldn't be talking about early diagnosis when there is no cure, but prompt diagnosis might be a better terminology to use and manage people's expectations. And how can we be using data to report on what really matters to the patients and their caregivers? Next slide, please. So the vision for this project was a responsive resource that gives access to data for patients and clinicians so that we could help answer the important and relevant questions about the brain cancer patient journey in near real time. And the other thing was that we wanted to establish a process that could be used by other cancer sites. And that's happened because it has now been rolled out by other charities like sarcoma. The values were that it had to be really collaborative, it had to be progressive, so it had to take the agenda forward, it had to be positive, it had to look at the whole pathway for the patient, and the data that was used had to be robust, it needed to be responsive, so virtually in real time, it needed to be meaningful for our community, it needed to value real life experience and have a focus on quality of life. And of course, the challenges were huge. There's clinical uncertainties around data quality, there's path dependency, there's lack of public understanding and trust around data, there's the governance and safety issues, and then ensuring integration with the National Cancer Research and Advisory Service and bringing NCPES into the fold as well. And it was breaking new ground. So this work started in 2016. It took us 3 years to get to the point where we could actually publish this data online. So next slide, please. It was really complex. And the first thing we needed to find out was, are we asking the right questions from the data to get the best use? So we wanted to look at registry data in new ways to address important questions for the brain tumour community, which consisted of all stakeholders, not just patients and caregivers, but clinicians as well, and allied health professionals, because we felt that there was a widening gap between the traditional approach of epidemiology of cancer and the wider questions that the clinical and patient community have. We wanted to broaden the discourse around the epidemiology of care. So for example, if you look at chemotherapy, how many cycles of patients with brain cancer do patients actually manage? Because they embark chemotherapy thinking they're going to complete all 6 cycles and have a 100% success rate. But actually, if you know that only 60% complete all 6 cycles, then that means you can have a better quality conversation and manage patients' expectations so they feel less of a failure. Equally, from a service provider viewpoint, to know whether your local hospital, what percentage of patients actually do complete 6 cycles of chemotherapy. Is it 80% or is it 60%? And if you've got another hospital at 60%, why is that? Is it because the quality of care for the patient is as good, or is it that the patient selection is better? So things like exploring variation from one oncology to a unit to another, looking at managing patients' expectations were key here. So the first thing we did was we looked with NCRAS about what data is there, what new work is happening, what new questions do we have, what can we answer, and what information critically is important to the community. And when we looked at the pathway, there was a significant, next slide please, exciting emphasis on patient experience. 89 questions once we deduped them. Out of that, 38 were on quality of life, so 43%. And there were sentiments expressed more than anything else. So the threat to way of life, the lack of behavior controls and impact on personality and loss of identity when you're diagnosed with a brain tumor, impact on relationships, systemic problems leading to isolation, access to support. And what the clinicians flagged was that they're very comfortable writing a script and referring patients for things like weakness, speech and language, headaches, pain. But when it comes to talking about uncertainty and fatigue, they really were uncomfortable talking about these things. So that's already enabled us to begin to plug that gap. So this was about translating what counts as data across social worlds of healthcare professionals, patients and their caregivers. What is key, we found, is using data to lead to knowledge that leads to change for the person with lived experience. So out of this work, we now have the Brains Trust dashboard. Next slide, please. The 89 questions, we read amber green because remember, this was about the methodology. The key question was, can we get the data that is sitting in NCRAS out in the public domain in a safe way, but in near responsive real time? So this is what the data looks like. What we did was we took the questions, we looked at which were the green questions, which were the ones that we knew the data already existed and we could easily get up on the platform. And then the amber questions are the ones that, well, we know the data exists, but maybe it's not in a form that is usable. And then the questions which we classified as red is actually the data doesn't exist, but that's not to say that we couldn't use that to influence the discourse in the future when we work with NCRAS, saying actually this is what the community want to ask questions about. So we agreed a standard slicing of the cancer data being a less common cancer. We worked out that using postcodes, brain tumor diagnoses, of which there are over 120 different types of brain tumors, you couldn't go less than 100 people in any one postcode area before that data might become identifiable. So you might have 2 people, for example, diagnosed with a grade 3 astrocytoma, one of whom is male and one of whom is female. So they would then immediately become identifiable. So Public Health England now have taken on board that this is how the slicing needs to be of the cake. We had 28,000 pieces of data. So we aim to get 100 people in every slice at least. So that gave us 280 groups, which we looked at. So all we've done so far is just take that basic data that we talked about, which was...
You've had a bit of an overrun. If you could...
Okay, I'm on my last slide. Age band, sex and ethnicity. And out of that, we had 3 stories emerging. We knew that there was variation in radiotherapy treatment given to children. There were variation in outcomes given to different age groups of people. And we found out that 10% of people diagnosed with a meningioma will die within the first year of a diagnosis. And they tend to fall off the back of the boat because it's considered a non-malignant brain tumor. So the next stage then is to look at the remaining questions as defined, thank you, next slide, by the JLA, which are quick wins in the eye. We've already mentioned the James Lind Alliance this morning, quick wins in the eyes of the registry with the right resource in place. So coming back, also references to stories. It's absolutely important that the stories are told behind the data, because that's what transforms the landscape for patients living with the experience. And it's the stories that will create change. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Now, unfortunately, Emily Lam couldn't be with us today, but she has sent us a pre-recorded video, which we'll now play.
Hello, my name is Emily. I thought I'd give you a bit of an account of where I came from and how come I got interested in the use of health data for research and healthcare purposes. It started off something like 5-6 years ago that I developed a number of long-term conditions, and I just like to be more linked up with people like me, people who have similar long-term conditions, which I have quite a few, and to see what sort of experience they've got and the kind of treatment they received, and so that I could learn where maybe treatments can be innovative elsewhere, that I could also benefit from the in my condition. And then I got interested in the large healthcare data sets available. We got such huge data sets available for research that came on stream. You will all be aware of HDR UK, and all these data sets are there ready to be utilized, to be connected, for any relationship to be studied, and the so that we can learn better and understand more about how maybe certain conditions respond better in some patient groups to certain treatments. So it's all very helpful. And so I got interested in that, and primarily I have a passion for primary care because my vision is that if I can support primary care, they can improve better prevention, investigation and treatment, and to shift resources and focus from hospital care to primary care, keeping people cared for in the community, identifying, detecting the illnesses early, that would lead to a better prospect of outcome. All these would help to keep people independent in their own homes and in the community for as long as possible. I've been impressed by useMYdata's creation of patient data citation. So I'm having different conversations with researchers to raise their awareness to this, so that they become more alert to the possibilities, the many potentials of partnering with patients and public in their research. Because I do passionately believe that we need to play a role in their journey to discovering better ways of doing things, delivering healthcare, so that in the end we all benefit. I tell you a bit of a failure story so far. I'm mindful of the need to promote transparency around GPDPR. So last year, through my MP, I was put in touch with Lord Bethel, who had the lead on that at the time, because he promised a public communication campaign that is nationwide to raise the awareness to the process used for GPDPR. But unfortunately, it never materialized. And then he was replaced by another Lord, Lord Camel. And so I got in touch with him, and unfortunately, yet again, there was no response. And I have been trying to follow up, but have been unsuccessful so far. So I'm sorry to say. I haven't got anything constructive to say on that side, but the truth is a work in progress, and it's a very slow and frustrating one at that.
I can't thank Emily directly, but I thank her that she actually recorded that and sent us in, and I hope she does get better. If the panelists could pop back on, I see that there are two questions that relate, they're quite similar. It's popped around. What kind of company organization is Flatiron? Is it profit making? And how is it different from DataCan?
Yeah, those are great questions and I'm happy to answer them. So Flatiron is a private company. We work with organizations across the commercial space, across the research community, and obviously with the public and social sector. I thought the question on how similar we are to DataCan was a really interesting one, and Chris, I attempted to kind of tag you in that question because I think it's a great one to discuss live. DataCan and Flatiron have really similar missions, and the way that we've both thought about this is that means that we can work really effectively together, and that by partnering, we're likely to be able to achieve even more than each one of us might be independently. Chris and Pete and really the whole panel at DataCan have been really instrumental to us as we shape what we do in patient engagement in the UK, and have really pushed us, I think, as a private company to go quite far along the journey along that ladder that Pete shared, and to really ask us how we can embed these principles in our organization as we establish it. I don't know if there's more you want to add on to that, Chris.
No, only briefly. DataCan is grant funded from a government grant. That's how it exists. And Flatiron is a commercial organisation. DataCan's role is to make sure that cancer data, in this case, is used most effectively, including looking at what different organisations need to put in place to be able to use that data effectively, which is the work we did with Lauren, amongst other things, on how to embed patients in what they do. And I'm hoping at some stage they'll shout a bit more loudly about what they've done in some of their earlier sites.
Thank you. A question that's come in again is that it's got a double. How does the ethnicity, belief, or views of staff have an impact? Is this data collected? And it ties in with, did you also look at the faith and ethnicity of patients that were or were not attending? Anyone?
I can probably try the first bit. Is the faith and ethnicity, belief and views of staff collected? I don't believe it is, unless it's done on a small scale. I think what we have seen is some surveys published about the views of healthcare staff generally, particularly more recently in the primary care setting, about what the healthcare staff views are on using and sharing patient data. That's an interesting read. My take from that is that in a primary care setting, in a GP setting, the staff seem to be more concerned about sharing data than some of the patients do. And I think there's something to be looked at in there. But some good reports which we can put links on when we send the copy of this this recording of the video out as well, if that helps. The other point I was quickly going to make on the ethnicity side is, in all the different equality side, we did a members learning session a couple of weeks ago where we looked at all the different data available across the equality dimensions, including ethnicity, in terms of what was there and what wasn't there. And that's on the website, but we can send a link through with that as well when we send the summary around.
I haven't come across new questions in the Q&A, but I see from the chat there was one, again, a general one. How do we get involved with the patient advisory group?
Was that the question to you? Was that for useMYdata?
I'm not sure, because I'm just popping over into the chat section.
So my advice would be just drop us an email. You'll see the email at the end of the presentation to useMYdata, either to me or to Emily or to Alison, or you can go via the website. And if it's to do with useMYdata, we'll help you out with that. If it's to do with linking in with any of the speakers here or the organizations, we can do that for you as well. So to just drop us an email.
No, I can't find any further questions in the Q&A. Emily, is there something I've missed?
No, that's fine. I think we'll move on to Chris's final presentation, if that's okay.
Okay, so we'll thank all the panelists. I mean, it's been very pressed for time, but unfortunately, that's the world we live in. So, Chris, if you could now bring up your final summary of the focus.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks all. I think what we wanted to hear today was not just about the work that useMYdata collectively has done, but what some of the individual members have done, whether they are patient relative care members or whether they are associate members, such as Lauren, for instance. So it's been good to hear some of those things. So just to look forward now in terms of the next 12 months, Em, if you could just click forward. There are only 2 slides here, just to keep it brief. And some of these things we may have mentioned. So what are the priorities for the next 12 months? Well, first of all, to continue to be this trusted patient voice. I think we've seen good evidence that people out there do see us collectively as a trusted group they can work with, they're happy to work with, and that they can trust. And I think that's a strength which we need to make sure we retain. So there's going to be a continuance of that role of the trusted patient voice. You'll have heard a lot of the stuff, particularly in my session, about being a UK, an England focus, GPDPR, NHS England, NHSX. There was a lot of England in there. I think that reflected the fact that there were some urgent things we needed to do in England at the time. But for the next 12 months, we want to return to a much more UK focus, which is where that's our spread is. So you'll see a much more of an ambitious program of work to try and get across the UK. And we will need the non-England members to help us out on that, putting us in contact, raising the issues that are local to them, highlighting good practice and other things that could help us with that. The third thing we're doing is continuing to host events such as this, and maybe even physical events at some point in time. You never know. Well, the feedback we get from these, particularly because we can get a shared audience in, researchers, people who are very positive about data sharing, people more reluctant about data sharing. We get a wide range of people attending these webinars and taking part. And that's one of the benefits of being a patient-led movement. We can begin to bring people to the table. This event's been slightly different, but we're going to continue to host data events. And if there are suggestions about what you'd like to see at these events, this is all led by and defined by you out there. So if you want certain topics to be raised and covered, you just need to shout and tell us that's what you want. And finally, the point about transparency, continuing all our work to bring transparency to the GPDPR program and other things as well. You'll see the little note at the bottom, if you can read at the bottom of your screen in blue. Transparency isn't something you do, it's a philosophy you need to live by and something which needs to be embedded across the organization. I think that's a mantra we need to push very hard with all the organizations who seem to be thinking they could just do transparency on a Friday and then it's all dealt with. So those are the priority areas for the next 12 months. Em, could you just click one through more? That's going to have to be underpinned by a set of things. First of all, maintaining our position as an independent patient-led movement. This is unique in this space of patient data. The fact that we are independent, patient-led, we can say what needs to be said. We don't have any over influence of other organizations. That independence is really critical, which we need to retain and push as well. Equally, using the position statements and the principles that we've written, that you've written, those need to be pushed out as well. We need to extend those in areas where you want them to be extended, things we need to be writing and summarizing so that you can use those in your daily lives, whether you're a healthcare professional, a researcher, a patient in your local practice or whatever. Those I think are becoming more and more useful. We also feed those directly into things like national consultations or where we get asked questions by people. The fact that we've got position statements and principles ready means we can get your voices out there into those conversations straight away. And the final three, growing our membership. And again, you'll see the point about across all 4 nations of the UK. We are UK focused. We do have UK membership and we need to maintain and grow the numbers of UK members across the organisation. There is a strength in numbers that we need. And the point about further increasing our influence with collaborations across a range of organisations, some of which may be more difficult to deal with than others, but I think we should not shy away from any of these different sets of organisations. We should be engaging with all, and we should bring all voices to the table. You don't get a balanced conversation, and I think that's a key point for us. And finally, we're only going to be able to do these things if we are able to secure additional funding. So there's a real focus on being able to secure additional funding. We are an extremely small organisation, smaller than most people realise, and we need to bring more funding in to be able to do some of these extra things. So those are our focus areas and some of the things we're going to have to do to underpin those things. Thank you, Em. I think that was it.
Thank you, Chris. I mean, that shows not only do we have quite a solid past, but we have a future that we really need to build on, and something where getting more people involved would be better. I see that it's been quite a vigorous discussion going on in the chat box, which is always good. But sadly, we were drawing to a close for this webinar. But I'd like to ask you for a final poll of all of you, which should be coming up onto your screens now. And again, I can't vote on this, but please indicate which of these best describes your relationship to useMYdata. And then on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 is low and 5 is high, how knowledgeable do you feel you are about the use of health data? Again, we've got a lot of members, and I'm glad to see there's a good number of interested patients, 30%, or member of the public who might wish to become more involved. As to the second question, which is sort of expected. I mean, it's good to see that many people feel that they are to a certain extent knowledgeable, so that we've got a lot to learn, and there are very few that know everything who know nothing, and let's hope that they learn something and will continue to learn something from that. Well, we hope that this slightly different session has proved useful to you. We wanted to hear from several of our members so that they might inspire others to be even more active in their own areas. And if any of you aren't yet members of useMYdata, hopefully this is your encouragement to join. No money is required, just an interest and possibly some passion in working to improve things. Let me close by thanking you all for your time and contributions today and for your questions. I hope we've been able to answer as many of these as possible. As I said at the start, the recording of the webinar will be available on the useMYdata website, as will highlights of the key points. We will also publish all the questions that have been submitted today. So finally, I would again like to thank Lauren, Bob, Oren, Fran, Rob, Pete, Helen, and Emily for their time and expertise in preparing and delivering today's webinar. And also let me extend my thanks to Emily and Chris of the useMYdata Secretariat, who've arranged, done all the background work, enabled the technology for this event to run seamlessly. We will be sending around a short survey tomorrow, and we're very grateful if you could take a few minutes to give your feedback, including suggestions for future webinars. We definitely hope to see you at future webinars. And just to finally say, my own particular role has been an invidious one of pushing people along as a timekeeper, but at least I seem to have fulfilled my one requirement was to make sure that this meeting ended on time. Well, thank you all for all participants, whether panelists or public members or anyone who was just watching. So at this point, I think we're actually 2 minutes ahead. I will shut down the meeting. Thank you.